shakes his head. For a second there, I thought Hans was going to get it. I thought Magnus had maybe pushed, has agreed. And here we go.
Okay, and Hans gets the white pieces in this game. He just won with black after a nice sacrifice for checkmate. Magnus couldn't take a rook because otherwise he would have been checkmated. He was left down a bishop. So now in this game, Danny, we've seen this before. This is a familiar opening. The players that keep going back to it, and it's actually worked quite well for Magnus. So I wonder what Hans is up his sleeve.
Yeah, Magnus is going back to something that worked well. It's been a good, okay, bishop d2 is new. Okay, so Hans has a new opening. A little bit of time, maybe, at the disagreement or discussion about game ops. Maybe he took a moment to reflect on what he wanted to do to change it, and indeed he has.
But look at Magnus, immediately hops into that d4 square. When you put your pawns like this, when it's kind of like a field goal post, you have to look at the square in between these two pawns, and immediately black takes over this square. The bishop helps out, and it seems like black is gaining important ground. It's not like white has gone wrong. It's just a strategic decision. And so Magnus, he hops in. Hans, on the other hand, has to be careful about how this game goes further, but it seems like Hans is unbothered. He wants to trade knights, go into that f5 square once again, and go for a kingside attack.
Yeah, it's a position we've seen before, but the structure very different now. I'm just looking at what Hans did with e4, d3, c4. This is a Botvinnik English structure, though not in English, and it is a strong one in terms of what it limits and controls, but it's also a targetable one, and so that's what Magnus does, striking with b5.
Yeah, whenever your opponent pushes a pawn forward, it becomes easier to attack that pawn, or at least try to trade off some material. And here we see that b takes c4 will be available. A rook may slide to b8 to try to gain an open file, but white is well defended for the time being. So the big question for Hans is what to do about this knight on d4. It's a really annoying piece at the moment. If knight takes, bishop takes, and suddenly there's pressure down on b2. So for Hans, this is not an easy choice. And you see actually Magnus, he seems to be bopping to some music.
Yeah. Magnus also has a Spotify playlist going. We saw the screen on camera when Hans was messing around with his playlist there, trying to switch up the tunes. Magnus also has a Spotify playlist. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but every player brought some sort of jams to jam to. God, I sound like such an old man when I say that.
Any Pearl Jam?
Any Pearl Jam and jamming, you know? But all right. The structure has changed. Magnus opens the b file, but the d4 knight is immediately being targeted.
Yes, now white has 3 attackers on that square, and that's why we see a trade on f3. The white queen takes back, trying to get into the attack, and black's knight steps back. It's not just to maneuver around. Rook f6 is a devastating threat all of a sudden. The bishop on a7 may be the best piece on the board. Of course, not the most valuable, but it's staring at the white kingside. Rook f6 is a huge threat, and for Hans right now, he wants to figure out, how do I keep my king defended? He brings his knight forward to f5, a great decision by him. Rook f6 looks like a pin, but you need to make g6 work. So this is always going to be dangerous with h6 hanging, but it actually may be a threat right now. So Hans has to calculate very carefully, because if g6 is played, let's say black at a free turn, and knight takes h6, check happens, the black king steps up to g7, and this rook on f6 is doing serious damage all the way down to f2. So this is why the queen steps back. g6 no longer so threatening. The knight takes and then retreats to g4, which protects this loose pawn on f2. So right now, it seems like both players have everything under control. White's structure a little bit healthier. This a6 pawn, it's a long-term weakness, and this is really far down the line. But what Hans would like to do eventually is start pushing these pawns on the queen side, because that's where his advantage lies in terms of having an extra b pawn compared to his opponent's extra d pawn. I prefer to have the b pawn because it is more mobile here, and eventually I can push that up the board. But all focus, all attention in the center right now. It looks like both sides just trying to time their pawn pushes accurately. g6 now becomes an idea. The knight will have to retreat to e3 to blunt this bishop on the diagonal. So it looks at the moment like Hans, he still is in control, but for Magnus Carlsen, he's keeping steady on the clock, and he's just trying to come up with an idea that allows him to not just parry off some of White's threats and kick some pieces back, but to actually create ideas of his own. It might be this knight on d7 that needs to venture forward. What is a good square? I'm not quite sure at the moment. f4 looks like the best possibility, but that's a long way away. The knight would have to wrap itself around and take 3 turns to get there. So a5 played, and that is quite a move. Bishop takes a5, there was bishop takes f2. That pawn is defended tactically. So a5 just gaining space, a really clever choice from Magnus, and Hans just brings his king in the corner. He may want some f4 stuff at some moment, but that's why Magnus quickly kicks the knight, out of f5. The rook slides out of the way of the and we could see some kind of F-pawn push eventually. Very risky stuff if Magnus goes for that, but it's one of these positions where white doesn't have the easiest plan either. So both players, they're holding each other, they're stopping the immediate threats, they're trying to come up with new ideas, and I think that Hans isn't exactly hiding his intentions. Rook F1 gets behind the pawn, F4 coming next. We would love to open files. Rooks need that. The D file, semi-open for the rook on D1, but there is a pawn on C7 protecting a pawn on D6. That's a great pawn chain. F4, on the other hand, makes that rook on F1 look very powerful, spying all the way down to F7. That is a weak point in black's setup. So right now, we see what Hans wants to do. How does Magnus react? Does he say, okay, F4 is the plan, let me make a move like G5? Do not do that. It's just stopping the one move idea. It's actually weakening way too many squares. So it looks like here, with the trade, we have knight against bishop, and now G5, because they're weak light squares, but only a dark square bishop. Bishops are stuck inherently to their color complex. That F5 square, you would love to bring that bishop around. I can do that with my mouse, but unfortunately for Hans, he can't do that with his bishop. It is stuck on the dark squares.
You can weaken the light squares if your opponent can't access them, right? That's what Magnus does at the right time. Appreciate you carrying their partner. So as I talk, will you move your lips so that it sounds like my voice is coming out of your mouth? Oh, there we go. That was fun. All right. Well, here we go. We got an equal position. Ooh, Magnus going to keep it closed, but at the expense of the D6 pawn. He doesn't like that D6 pawn today. He's made it weak several times.
He made it weak, but it's not that easy to attack. And this knight B8, knight C6, knight D4 would be the idea. But knight B8 walks into queen takes C5. So watch out. When there's a pin down a file, you have to see what happens when the piece in between gets out the way. So queen takes C5 is in the air if this knight were to move.
Indeed. Okay, move G3. I like that move because the king side for black is potentially open, just like Magnus launched an attack against Hans from this same game when he was black. If Hans could play F4 here, open up the F file, and somehow create some diagonals for that bishop on C3, Magnus could live to regret that move G5.
But that's why he lined up his queen and his rook. He's saying, please go F4. Your E4 pawn will be an immediate target. And it won't really be a target. It'll just be scooped off the board. And knight B8 played. The engine reacts a little bit, but I'm actually ignoring the evaluation bar completely because this is such a complex position. The players have no idea who's better here. But this knight wants to be better placed and hop in this D4 square, just blockading white's potentially double rooks in the D file before the rook on F1 even gets there.
Yeah, if that knight gets to D4, you've highlighted it a couple times now, the game changes, and at least black's losing chances probably go away, right? So Hans wants to do something before Magnus fully coordinates and kind of reunites the clans. Does he risk F4 while that knight is a little bit out of the way?
I think that's just playing to lose. This E4 pawn is too loose in many of these positions. I know that that opens diagonals, so there is something to fear if you are Magnus Carlsen, but I just think it's taking too much risk. Right now, the position does remain closed. The issue with closed positions, though, in the long term is knights outclass bishop. So I think that Hans has a difficult choice right now, whether to push for F4, play for the idea of F4. He brings his rook into D5, but knight C6 now seems to be the optimal reply. Just get that pony into the position.
I'm going to say, what's his follow-up to knight to C6? You don't really want that rook to get trapped there, although in theory, if you take on D4 with the bishop, that rook isn't trapped, right? It gets some sort of new life, whether toward the king side or the queen side, depending on how black takes it. Yeah, you've got a rook that will open up if Magnus plays knight D4. And so Hans is kind of baiting Magnus here, inviting him to put the knight on the most obvious square and allow the rook-ending trade.
And knight b4, by the way, attacks that rook, and that rook has nowhere to go. So it might have encouraged a capture on the b4 square, but instead we see the knight hop into d4. Bishop takes a5. It looks like a free pawn, but the black queen can even slide over to a7. You line them up, and that a2 pawn drops into the white king that's in trouble. So even a black push on the king side, you would think that with this kind of pawn structure, with e5 and g5, the f5 square could be vulnerable. White doesn't have the firepower to get there, and we see that both players, they're deep in thought, but they're also approaching a minute for Magnus, and Hans down to 49 seconds.
Down to 49 seconds. You don't want to be in this spot against Magnus Carlsen. We've said it many times, and I'll say it again. He makes good chess moves fast. And so when you don't have a lot of clock, you don't have a lot of chances. But Hans plays rook c1, keeping up with him. He wants c5. That's obvious. Robert highlights it before I can say it. a3, maybe trying to create a pass b pawn. I like that move from Hans.
But creating a passer in the b file will open up the a file. Queen b7 says you're not even playing b4 anyway, but c5 seems extra tempting. You're just trying to open your rooks, connect them, and go after what is an exposed black king side. But instead, rook b1, so playing this a bit timidly. Maybe it's this decision-making is informed by the fact that he only has, well, now 27 seconds and the time is ticking.
Rook f6 is a sneaky move. It opens up all kinds of tactical possibilities at the end of f2. It's one of those moves that doesn't look tricky at all in the moment, right? But that f2 pawn is weak. It's only guarded by the king, now the queen. So Magnus trying to set up the future possibility that Hans will blunder, which is the kind of thing Magnus does when his opponents get under time pressure. That's how you win games that you shouldn't win.
And the lead on the clock is actually substantial at the moment. You see that black has about 35 seconds and white down to 13. So if you can find a tricky option, then Hans could be in trouble. But the position remains very close, and Hans is shuffling back and forth. Maybe a timely rook to the c-file to try to get a4 in, but that a5 pawn is actually keeping that rook on a8 honest, and I don't see how you make progress.
Magnus sitting tight. He doesn't know why he played queen to b7. I think he just shook his head at his own move. He's like, why did I do that? Didn't read his list. Ooh, but now that allows d5, rook to b6 from Hans. What's going to happen?
He takes e4.
Oh, you can't do it. You take e4. Oh, wait. Hans is going for this forcing line. The queens are going to come off the board, or that white king might get in trouble.
Yeah, this queen is under attack. King takes f6. It looks like your king is out in the line of fire, but again, there's not enough pieces for white to attack this king. So this rook on 8's in trouble. Queen e6 is the move you want to play, but you drop the rook in the corner. So the d pawn runs up, but Danny, the black king, I see the evaluation bar all the way in black's favor, but it looks risky.
Oh, it's queen to d8, and the d pawn runs. Oh my God. What a I was like, what is the move that would win there? Magnus Carlsen tends to find them. Queen to d8, and that forces black to the defensive. Oh. And okay, now it's like precision time. A second pass pawn. Oh, Magnus gives up the d pawn in the process, though.
Yeah, that's not the pawn you wanted to give up. And the rook d6, that's not heading in the right direction. You have to go after the black king. And excuse me, that's a second queen, and white's first is gone. Yeah. That's a win for Magnus Carlsen.
Yeah. Queen to f3 was not ideal.